Our keynote speaker is somebody I met at another conference, probably the first live conference we did, Kimberly Nevala. She's the strategic advisor and advisory business systems solution manager for SaaS. And yes, I had to read that from the teleprompter in there. I've spoken with Kimberly at conferences, and she's been a guest on my weekly podcast, hashtag Trending the Weekend Edition. I asked her to come in and set the stage, to talk about the potential of analytics and to help us understand the barriers to progress and how we can achieve the potential. Kimberly, there's nobody better than Kimberly to do this. Welcome and come on up.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate the invite. And as Jim said, I had an opportunity to speak with him for his podcast last week, and it generated some thoughts I'll share with you today. So the title of our presentation here is a business imperative for data analytics and innovation. But what I really want to talk to you about is what are the common attributes and attitudes that organizations who are successful in adopting analytics broadly actually demonstrate. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that if I asked you quickly off the top of your head to jot down areas in your organization where analytics is being used, everybody could do that today with very little effort. Analytics is visible, it is increasingly understood, and increasingly core to a lot of our business practices. And the areas that you jotted down would include some common things like marketing and sales, risk and fraud, and then there would be a whole breadth of different operational areas specific to the industry and your specific function. Now, if we take that level of awareness and some general adaptation in the enterprise, and we add on the increasingly of late breathless headlines about things like AI that can generate art and can compose prose, and these headlines that are increasingly either concerned or excited, depending on their perspective, about AI and analytics' impact on every aspect of our lives, we would be forgiven for thinking that everything, everywhere, is coming up and dependent on analytics. And perhaps we wish that were so. The reality, however, is that for most organizations, the story's a little bit different. When we talk to companies broadly, regardless of their level of analytics maturity, most organizations will point to a lot of success in key areas. Again, in a lot of cases, they're areas or functions of the organization that may have always been more analytically inclined, sales, marketing, fraud, risk, et cetera, so on and so forth, and that those functions and lines of business have been increasingly successful in adapting ever more mature and advanced analytics capabilities and embedding those into their business processes. But almost all organizations still struggle to diffuse those analytic capabilities more broadly and evenly distribute them throughout the organization in areas that maybe were not historically as inclined towards data and analytics. And it's interesting, because when I had the chance to talk with Jim last week, he had mentioned a study. And he mentioned a study in which the percentage of companies that self-identified as data-driven has actually fallen over the last 3 years, consistently. And I started to think about, why is that? Is that because these companies have less data? Not likely. Is it because they're no longer using the analytics tools that they had before? Probably not. The real answer is probably that our definition of what it means to be data-driven is changing. Not so very long ago, if we asked ourselves, is your company data-driven, we would be looking for, to what extent do your leaders, your business execs, consult things like business forecasts or data trends when they're making decisions. Today, however, if I asked, is your business data-driven, you're much more likely to be thinking about, or what that would look like is hyper-automation. No decision left behind, by which I mean no decisions left to us fallible humans without some insight and input from the machine. And AI that is deployed everywhere. Again, this is simply not the reality in most organizations. And I don't want you and your compatriots to be discouraged by that. There's a new book out called The Power Power and Prediction. And the authors refer to the current moment in time as the between times. And what they point to is this gap between what we all understand to be the potential value of advanced analytics and AI and the value most organizations are actually getting from them today. Now, to be clear, we've made a lot of investments, both externally in the market and internally with companies. And I could spend a little bit of time going through those numbers, and we could talk about why those investments to date may or may not have led directly to impacts in your organization. But I'm not going to do that, mostly because I think it's actually not that important. Your organization is where your organization is. And regardless of where that is, it is very likely that you are not alone on that particular corner. And every organization has the opportunity to improve and adapt and adopt analytics more mindfully and to drive value on a move-forward basis. So let's not worry too much about what's gone before. Let's think a little bit about what comes next. And to do that, I want to just touch briefly on 6, what I'm going to say, attributes or attitudes that organizations who do make a good use of analytics or are deploying analytics most pervasively display. Maybe not all of them, but a lot. And then through the course of the day, you're going to hear from companies that are actually putting some of these things into practice, and you'll understand how they're doing that in the real world. So the first element is that, and this is going to seem simple, but I think it's simply profound. Organizations that are able to use analytics and AI well focus on solving problems. Full stop, end of story. These organizations are also focused on solving a broad spectrum of problems. So they're applying analytics and AI to problems that are both big and small. And in fact, the companies that are most mature report that the balance between use cases that you might consider operational and those that are more strategic, so things that are focused on operational efficiencies versus creating new products or services, is about 50-50. So if we want to be an analytics sort of first company, that means that we are solving that broad spectrum of problems. But I think more importantly is that companies who do this well no longer think about and plan for their data and analytics strategy as separate from their business strategy. Instead, as they're thinking about what are the actions we need to take as a company or as an individual, what are the decisions I want to be able to make or need to make in the future, they are proactively thinking, how and where can I apply data and analytics to improve that decision or outcome? And I have a really simple test for organizations if they're not sure if data and analytics are today integral to their business plans. And that is, go and take a look at whatever your company's version of the strategy on a page is, and everyone has it. If data and analytics don't have a spot on that page, if your data and analytics strategy is the appendix or a different page, you're not there yet. And we need to sort of concentrate on that. Okay, so the second thing that organizations that are deploying or unleashing analytics pervasively do is they use a broad spectrum of tools. Now, I already nattered on a little bit about the need to solve problems big or small. But the interesting thing here is that organizations that are most mature are the least inclined to be distracted by the new bright and shiny objects. They use the most simple, well-proven technique they can to solve any problem. And they do not spend a lot of time going back and re-architecting or redesigning something that already works just because there's a new method that could also work. So we might not take our old approach to forecasting and replace it with a machine learning model unless I can show a germane business impact and reason for doing that. Why do I bring that up? It's important because they are not spending a lot of time just retreading existing ground, but now they actually have the headspace to go out and find new analytics problems to solve in new areas of the business, because we're not just trying to make these incremental, potentially non-germane improvements in areas that are already doing pretty well. The other aspect of this is that they realize that the analytic tools and platforms are a means to an end. Now, there is no question that a lot of the low-code, no-code, citizen data scientists, you'll hear them referred to platforms, are very, very important. And they can get a lot more people in your organization developing insights, models, et cetera. It's extremely critical. But you should be under no illusion that the majority of your employees want to roll their own analytics. They don't, and they won't. And nor does their job or their function likely require them to moving forward. So I use the analogy, but this doesn't mean that they're not interested in doing better with insights and outcomes that a model could give them. It's just a little bit like a parent who hides the spinach in their kid's cheesy lasagna. They prefer that those insights are delivered to them in the context and in line of their existing business process flows and workflows, not as a separate tool. And organizations that assume that analytics and AI are going to be self-serve for everybody may find that analytics and AI are self-serve or used by nobody. Now, the third thing that organizations do is they invest incrementally and mindfully in infrastructure. And again, that analytics and data infrastructure strategy is closely tied to their operational and transactional infrastructure strategy. And what this looks like is companies that, for instance, yes, are early adopters to the cloud, but they're not running to lift and shift everything and every analytic workflow and all the data immediately to the cloud. They're being mindful about the analytic workloads that make sense and would benefit from the capabilities that are available on the cloud. It means that they invest in developing a robust blueprint for modern data pipelines, but they don't try to move every data stream onto it before people start using it. They prioritize those data streams based on the use cases and actual usage and value in the organization. It also means that we are proactive in identifying what is required to actually deploy an analytic model and maintain it in production while we were defining the problem up front, while we're defining the business requirements themselves, so that we don't get caught out at the back end of this process. And we can actually be proactive about bringing new practices, model ops, data ops, into the organization before they are needed. Fourth, education and knowledge. Organizations that, again, are showing the best response. There was an Art of AI Maturity study done by Accenture earlier this year. And in that study, only 12% of companies identified as what they called AI achievers. So these were companies that are deploying AI pervasively and in fact are showing immense returns from it. They could, on average, these companies are saying they can relate 30% of their revenue gains to their AI projects overall. I mean, that's a staggering amount. What I found really interesting was that 78% of those AI achievers have mandatory training for employees at all levels of their companies. Now, when we go and talk to companies about what does training look like, what is data and analytic literacy, we tend to default to thinking that this is about teaching people number sense, understanding statistics, maybe knowing how to use these tools, right? But probably the more important part is that we teach everybody in the organization to what I'm going to call analytic recognition, so that the people in your organization can actually know and identify the types of questions and the problem they can answer and the problems they can solve with analytics. Why is this important? It's important because it increases the surface area, if you will, of the number of people who can identify problems we can apply analytics to. And because these people are identifying problems they care about, it increases the likelihood that the solution will be adapted. Back to point number one, you have to solve a problem somebody cares about solving for adoption. Now, all of that being said, we have to acknowledge that the presence of analytics in an organization, the capabilities, the tools, in and of itself, does not guarantee that your organization's decision-making capabilities or overall intelligence is going to improve. In a somewhat, I thought, witty criticism of people who do not understand analytics and leaders who pretend to use data, Andrew Lang, different from Andrew Wang, has said he uses statistics like a drunk uses a lamppost for support and not illumination, right? And it sounds a bit like a joke. However, there was a recent study by Growth AQ, And in that study, 22% of the decision makers, only 22% of the decision makers that were surveyed said that they use the insights and data that are provided to them when they're making decisions. And those are insights and recommendations they asked for, and they're still not using them. So how do we solve that problem? We have good insight, we've got models, we've got good insight. How do we solve for behavior? Well, it turns out that we have to practice. Like so many other things, we have to develop the muscle and the skill in our organization to make good decisions using information. Frankly, I could probably use this in my day-to-day life as well. But what this means is that we are going to be very deliberate about identifying the decisions that we want to inform or make with analytics. And we are also going to define how we will make the decisions using the information that is provided. And then we're going to monitor the outcomes of those decisions. And as many of you may already know, we call this new practice, if you will, decision intelligence, or DI. Now, to be clear, the point of DI is not to eliminate human judgment. The point of DI is so that we are clear about how we apply the machine prediction. How will the human use that machine prediction when they are making a decision or making judgment? And what DI, didn't want to do that quite yet. What DI, this is what happens when I have things in both hands. What DI actually allows us to do is avoid this really common problem of, I'll know it when I see it. I'll know it when I see it if it's good enough for data and analytics. The other thing it does is it forces us to really think a bit about why somebody might not use or respond to the solution that we're developing in the way we expected that they would. So a simple example. We know, and you'll have seen this out there, that we can use computer vision and machine learning to read a mammogram, for instance. Now, there's some obvious questions. One is, how accurate does that machine learning model need to be before we can use it on real-life patients in real life? Decision intelligence requires us to answer that question before we start to develop the model. So we define a set goalpost, and it doesn't just sort of move willy-nilly. The other thing that it forces us to ask is, all right, if we can hit that level of accuracy, how will that machine output be integrated into a clinical workflow? Are we going to show every scan that the machine identified as potentially non-normal to a radiologist? When we show to the radiologist, are we going to highlight the part of the scan that the machine identified as being suspicious? What about all of those likely normal scans? Because we know that there's a bunch of false negatives in there as well. How are we going to present those to a radiologist to review and ensure that they do that deliberately and consistently and don't fall prey to overconfidence in the machine categorization over time? Where, maybe 9 out of 10 times the machine's right, they agree it's normal. And on the 10th time, it's not. But as the machine, on balance, is more right than wrong, we start to pay less attention, right? It's also the self-driving car monitored by human problem. So decision intelligence allows us to address these kinds of questions. And they're complicated because these are not questions of numbers and math. They're questions of process and people. The other area that decision intelligence is important in is when we're looking at machine predictions that relate to actions that we do not, or factors outside of our control. It is relatively easy for us to look and see that Kimberly profile. My profile looks a lot like other people who have in the past defaulted on a loan. It is very difficult, and I would argue categorically impossible, for you to know that Kimberly is going to default on a loan, even though I look very similar to these other folks. So decision intelligence requires us to really think about what's the implication of the judgments we make using these predictions, and are there maybe other ways or interventions we want to pursue instead of just, in this case, denying Kimberly a loan. Okay. Now, the last bit I want to sort of put a plug in for is for governance. The sort of standard approach to governance or thinking about governance is that governance is going to stymie innovation. And I would argue exactly the opposite, that governance done well, particularly now when we have to be attendant not just to risks, but increasingly to rights, is the key to unlocking innovation. And a recent MIT report, in fact, showed that 64% of managers who had mature RAI, or responsible AI programs, in their organizations reported a greatly increased rate of innovation and adoption for AI and advanced analytics. And the reason is that if we do governance right, governance is about enabling critical thinking and allowing people to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. And we can take some pages from two areas to increase the ability or the critical thinking ability of our organizations. The first is from futurists. Now, I'm not talking about predicting the future and bending it to our will. I'm talking about forcing our teams to think beyond a cursory analysis or just considering experiences and outcomes that we ourselves have. The futurist playbook says that we need to challenge ourselves to think about a range of outcomes and scenarios, probable and improbable, and factor that into the policies and decisions we take. And if we do that, we will be much better, potentially, at seeing around the corner and identifying some of those unintended consequences and second-order effects that are tripping so many of us up today. The next, and I think most underrated skill set or tool in our governance toolkit is storytelling. If you want to kill a governance program, I will tell you how to do it, and you can do it fast. The single best way to do this is by trying to create an all-inclusive list of rules. Right? The how-to get. You cannot do it. You cannot come up and understand every possible eventuality. And TLDR, too long, no one's going to read it. Yeah. So storytelling gets around this because storytelling allows us to communicate what our principles are, what our desired behaviors and outcomes, without having to dictate every single circumstance that they might apply in. So if we think about an asset like the AI incident database, this is a compendium, publicly available, of stories of AI gone wrong and stories of AI gone very, very wrong. And they range from humorous to horrifying. But one thing that is true is once you read those lists and you look at those examples, the next time you go to apply or think about an analytics model, you're going to consider a whole lot of perspectives you wouldn't have otherwise. And you're going to do that without me telling you that you have to consider them in this circumstance. So my argument is that storytelling may actually be the linchpin for us to actually not only increase the ability of our organizations to think critically, but to implement adaptive governance. And this is absolutely critical because the data, the tools, the techniques that we use are constantly changing. And as I said up front, even the definition of what it means to be data-driven or to innovate responsibly are also changing, both in response to the new capabilities available to us, but also to increasing public and social awareness. So change is the only constant, and adapt you must. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jim, and he's going to bring up a stellar cast to show you how they're actually adapting in the real world.
Don't you go away.
Oh,
we got a couple questions here. We asked the people, the studio audience, not the studio audience, but our audience across Canada to some questions. And you get your amazing Karnak one, because one of the questions as you were talking about it came in and said, the Accenture report said that the amount of investment in AI has far outstripped the amount of growth in AI adoption. I think you sort of covered that. Yeah. Any other comments on that? Or?
No, I think that there's a new book out. It's called, I think it's called Power and Prediction, and they speak to this sort of gap. And to some extent, I think that's always going to be true. I think in 5 years we're going to be talking about the next development that the investment has outstripped. We're always a little bit behind in adoption, and I think that if companies spend too much time worrying about, money already spent and the sort of opportunity cost, we just don't make a whole lot of progress. So yes, more broadly, we should be making sure that we're developing these capabilities in a way that people can make use of in a practical operational sense. But for you, on the ground, again, I think that's just the nature of a new technology, frankly. We're at that sort of inflection in the curve. And if you spend too much time and effort in your organization thinking about all the reasons you failed in the past to adopt these technologies, you will also fail to adopt them in the future.
Yeah. Bernadette's out there. Bernadette, you asked about success of cybersecurity awareness programs. We'll get you some information on that. I'll send you some stuff. Kimberly, you may have some things on that as well. We can.
Nope, I'm going to defer. There's a panel on that today.
Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's true. Yeah. We might even have some on that.
Yeah.
Great. So one of the other, and I got this. I'm just going to summarize this in there. I don't see enough rigor around the. Sorry, these move around on me. I don't see enough rigor around the change management when analytics solutions are implemented. I don't see enough training to do the difference once an analytics solution is implemented. There's a couple of questions along that line.
Yes, amen, correct, 100%. And in fact, that is the reason we're seeing this push to decision intelligence, or DI. Now, you will hear vendors, including us at SAS, will talk about decision intelligence platforms that allow you to automate and monitor decisions. But that's really not what we're talking about here. Decision intelligence is about bringing together data science, managerial science, and social science, and things like behavioral economics, for instance, psychology, so that we can actually have a really deliberate think about how it is that analytics and the insights we're developing will be applied. And that includes, how do we have to actually change the workflow process? I use this very simple example of a store stock out model that says, when should you throw something on the shelf out because it's not going to sell? Okay, fine, right? We're optimizing. What could possibly be unethical or, problematic about that? But if the store personnel and the manager, his incentives are based on him selling, no matter at what a discount, just based on straight revenues, his incentives and the incentives that you are not in line with the incentive or the outcome you're developing that model for, it's not going to get used. And it's a really simple example, and it's not a life and death consequence. But we need to move away from the idea of change management, i.e. we're managing change in a single event, to managing change holistically. And DI, I think, is going to be a key to that.
Yeah, and I think one of those things, and you said it, I wrote down the note, it's profoundly simple. Right. If you're solving someone's problem, you don't have a change management problem. And I think that's one of the things I took away from your presentation. Kimberly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's so great to see you, and it's so great to have you here.
Thank you.
All right.